I've created my top 36 running back rankings in tiers for you today, and we've got a lot to cover, so let's dive right in. In tier 1, I'm going to start things off with Austin Ekeler. The biggest knock on Ekeler is his age at 28 years old. After that, you can't really find anything else to not like about the guy in fantasy. Consistent and reliable volume as a rusher and a receiver, he's a key part of an elite offense, and 38 total touchdowns over the past 2 seasons, the guy's a fantasy rock star in full PPR. Now this might be controversial, but I'm going with a rookie running back next, and that's Bijan Robinson. We know last season the Falcons were just second behind the Bears in rushing attempts, and let's not forget how this offense allowed 2022 fifth-round pick Tyler Algier to rush for over 1,000 yards in his rookie season. What do you think they're going to do now with the best running back prospects and Saquon Barkley on their roster? They're going to get their money's worth with the 8th overall pick. That's what they're going to do. By my projections, I've got Bijan averaging just over 19 fantasy points per game, and he should be a mainstay in fantasy for years to come. Closing out this tier, Christian McCaffrey is my RB3. Now, there's no denying CMC is elite in fantasy, and a full 17-game season in 2022 reminded everyone just how dynamic a talent he is. The reason he falls to third on my list is actually because of the team he plays for. You might have thought CMC would dominate snap percentage and touches for the 49ers like he used to in Carolina, but nope. Kyle Shanahan believes in a committee approach to the running back position, and he continued to utilize Elijah Mitchell when healthy. That's going to force CMC to be more efficient with fewer touches in this offense, and at the end of the day, talent and opportunities are the most important factors for running back success in fantasy. Saquon Barkley leads off tier 2 for me. With career highs in rushing attempts and yards in 2022, Brian Daboll clearly has no issue leaning on his RB1, and neither should you. Barkley is a legitimate top 5 running back when healthy and deserves to be a first rounder in fantasy drafts. With the recent news of Josh Jacobs signing his new contract with the Vegas Raiders, his ADP is sure to rise much closer to the round 1-2 turn. Jacobs handled nearly 400 touches last season, and at just 25 years old, don't let that volume scare you off. Run towards it, just like Jacobs will be running towards another RB1 finish in 2023. Tony Pollard took over in the second half of the Cowboys season in 2022, and now that Ezekiel Elliott is off the running back market, it's finally time to see if Pollard can lead fantasy managers to success on his back entering his 5th season as a Cowboy. Pollard has averaged north of 5 yards per carry in 3 of his 4 previous seasons, and should be a solid contributor through the air as well. With Derrick Henry next in this tier, I think you can guess why he's not higher in my rankings. Going into year 8 at age 29, Henry is facing the RB age cliff, and historical data would suggest he's poised to take a significant step down in production this season. Now, I know as well as you that King Henry is a game wrecker capable of much more than your average league running back, and that's why I still have him ranked inside my top 10 at the position. He likely could take a step back in production this season and still finish in the top 8 at the position rather than the top 4 like we've been used to seeing. Henry saw career highs in receptions, targets, and receiving yards in 2022, and I expect those numbers to persist and potentially even improve sooner than I expect them to be viewed as outliers. With King Henry, we may be witnessing his renaissance in 2023. To start tier 3, I'm going with Ramandre Stevenson, and I can already hear people saying, Blake, don't you know that Ezekiel Elliott just signed with the Patriots? He's going to take all the goal line work from Stevenson. What are you thinking ranking him this high? I want to remind you that Stevenson finished last season as RB7 with just 6 total touchdowns. He achieved that finish with strong rushing efficiency at just under 5 yards per carry, and led the team, not just among running backs, the entire team, with 69 receptions on 88 targets. Look it up. We're talking about PPR rankings here, and Stevenson catches the football a ton in this Patriots offense. Not to mention, the next 2 running backs behind Stevenson in receptions last season, Damien Harris and Pierre Strong, aren't even on the roster anymore. Zeke doesn't catch passes anymore either. He had 17 catches in 15 games played last season. The fact that you can draft a talent like Stevenson in the mid to late 3rd round is disgusting. Don't sleep on him. Now moving on, when it comes to Nick Chubb, I know I'm lower on him than the consensus, ranking him as my RB9 on this list. Chubb is always solid, but never truly elite, at least in PPR formats. With a season-best 36 catches on 49 targets back in 2019, we may see Chubb make a push for stats closer to that compared to his more recent seasons following the departure of Kareem Hunt. But heading into year 6, I think we likely know by now what to expect from Chubb. He's a touchdown-dependent fringe RB1. Jahmyr Gibbs is next in this tier for me. Usually you wouldn't expect to see this many rookie running backs ranked as high as I have so far. However, when you look at when teams take running backs in the first 12 picks of the NFL draft, those guys have a tendency to immediately produce in fantasy their rookie season. Here are a few examples. Saquon Barkley in 2018, RB1. Leonard Fournette in 2017, RB9. Ezekiel Elliott in 2016, RB2. Todd Gurley in 2016, RB15. With the combination of O-line and Gibbs' pass-catching skills, I find it more likely than not that he will join this group of accomplished fantasy running backs in 2023. Next up, I want to talk about Joe Mixon. Mixon's ADP all offseason has skewed lower than his talent would otherwise suggest for a few reasons. The first hurdle Mixon had to clear was whether or not he would still be on the Bengals roster this season. That concern was put to rest when he restructured his deal, taking a pay cut to stay with the team back in July. Then there were legal concerns with an alleged aggravated menacing charge for which Mixon was acquitted of earlier this month. Now we're in late August/early September, peak fantasy draft season, and Mixon's ADP is still in the high 30s. Since 2018, in seasons where Mixon played a minimum of 14 games, he has just one season finished outside of the top 10 at running back. He was RB13 in 2019. So in my mind, Mixon belongs in this range of my rankings and should be going much higher in drafts. Now next up is Naji Harris. Naji disappointed fantasy managers last season when people expected him to build off of a top 3 finish at the position as a rookie. But let's keep things in perspective here. Despite some struggles, Harris still finished as RB14. Now Naji goes in the middle to late third round of drafts, and things should swing back in a positive way with the expected improvement of Kenny Pickett going into year 2. We know how talented the 25-year-old is, and it wouldn't surprise me to see him finish the season as an RB1 once again. We're a third of the way through this list, and I want to remind you to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. My goal is to help you win your fantasy football leagues this year, so if you're enjoying the video, leave a like and stay tuned for more content like this. Now back to the tier list. In tier 4, we're starting things off with Travis Etienne. Etienne was an efficient rusher last season, averaging over 5 yards per carry, but we haven't seen him utilized in the passing game like he was back in his final season at Clemson. Etienne has been quoted saying, "You have to diversify your game. You can't just be a downhill bruiser. We have to continue to evolve and grow our game." Potentially hinting at the idea that he'll be more involved as a receiver in year 3. Despite a lower receiving volume and only 5 rushing touchdowns, Etienne finished the season as RB17, and I expect that growth, as he called it, to show in 2023. I've got Breece Hall ranked as my RB14, but I think you should fade him at his ADP in redraft leagues. Here's why. The Jets went out and signed Dalvin Cook early this month, so Hall could be eased back into the offense coming off a torn ACL suffered in Week 7 of last season. This is not an Adrian Peterson-like situation. Dalvin Cook, who I'll talk more about later in the video, was RB11 last season. That's stiff competition for the 22-year-old to share a backfield with, when we know players coming off ACL injury typically return to pre-injured form in year 2 of recovery rather than the subsequent season. So if you play in a league where there's an active trade market, let one of your league mates who's hyped up from watching Hard Knocks draft haul and see how long it takes before they're listing him on the trade block. Why pay the draft premium today when you can scoop him up later, closer to mid-season for pennies on the dollar potentially? Up next, I'm going with Aaron Jones. Jones has been a top 10 fantasy running back 4 consecutive seasons, but he's teetering on the dreaded age cliff, turning 29 this December. In addition to that, there's no guarantee that this offense will be remotely as efficient as years past with Jordan Love running things. I expect Jones to be a mid-range RB2 this season. At 16, I've got DeAndre Swift. This is based on the combination of individual talent from Swift and the quality of his O-line in Philadelphia. Now, understandably, given his size and injury history through 3 seasons in Detroit, Swift won't be the lone rusher in this backfield, but his abilities as a pass catcher make up for his underwhelming rushing volume in PPR formats. Not to mention the touchdown upside is certainly there. Being a part of arguably the best offense in the NFC, Swift has been a mid to low end RB2 thus far, but a fully healthy season could bump him up to RB1 status in a hurry. James Conner is next for me. Another player with injuries holding back his true potential in fantasy, Conner goes into 2023 with only Keontae Ingram and Corey Clement backing him up. The Cardinals are likely going to be one of the worst teams in the NFL this season, and Conner is poised to dominate in touches, not needing to worry about Arizona signing a veteran free agent to share this backfield with. Touchdown upside is your greatest concern, but volume should keep Conner comfortably in the RB2 range. To begin tier 5, Kenneth Walker is my RB18. Early last season, following an injury to teammate Rashad Penny, who could have predicted that, Kenneth Walker was thrust into the starting job for the Seahawks. With that opportunity, he immediately balled out, averaging just under 17 fantasy points per game, and when playing over 50% of the snaps, during that stretch, his typical workload was 19 carries and about 2.5 targets per game. With Seattle spending an early second-round pick on Zach Charbonnet in this year's draft, I don't expect Walker to maintain that same level of involvement in the offense this season, but Walker's talent is undeniable. Walker should still be a mid to high-end RB2. Alexander Madison is next on this list. We've been saying for years how Madison is easily the most valuable handcuff in fantasy football, backing up Dalvin Cook over the past 4 seasons. Now Dalvin is on the Jets, and Madison just signed a 2-year extension to stay with Minnesota and presumably function as the team's primary running back. The biggest question surrounding Madison going into 2023 is if he'll be able to sustain the level of production we've seen in brief stints as the lead back over the course of a 17-game season. And while we won't know for sure until we've seen it one way or another, I tend to believe the Vikings knew what they were doing when they extended Madison and released Cook this offseason. Based on my personal projections, I have Madison averaging around 15.5 fantasy points per game, and the only reason he's not ranked higher in this list for me is the fact that we haven't seen it from him for an entire season yet. I'm ranking Miles Sanders next in this tier. I think it will be an adjustment for Sanders playing in Carolina, as he has only ever ran behind the Eagles' dominant O-line, averaging over 5 yards per carry in that time. The Panthers have an O-line that ranks inside the top third of the league, so it's not a dramatic downgrade, but it is a step down nonetheless. Touchdowns and rushing efficiency were 2 things fantasy managers had to rely on from Sanders last season, as he only contributed 20 catches for 78 yards across 17 games in 2022. With rookie quarterback Bryce Young, I don't expect there to be nearly as many scoring opportunities for Sanders, and that's why I have him ranked here despite finishing as RB15 last season. Next is Damien Pierce. After a rookie season of 13 games played, Pierce finished as RB28. In games where Pierce played at least 50% of the snaps, he averaged about 13.3 fantasy points, 17 carries, and 3 targets per game. The Texans signed free agent Devin Singletary this offseason, but it's a 1-year prove-it type deal. That being said, I do expect the Texans to utilize a split backfield at least to start the season, which will limit Pierce's year 2 upside in this rebuilding Houston offense. Now, I told you eventually we'd get to talk more about him. To round out this tier, I've got Dalvin Cook as my RB22. We already discussed how Cook was an RB1 on Minnesota last season, but he's now with the Jets and has a lot of early season value with Breece Hall recovering from a torn ACL. I believe Dalvin can still push for fringe RB1 production, but there's a young future superstar waiting in the wings on this roster that will eventually make the situation much more complicated to navigate for fantasy managers. From a season-long perspective, I believe Hall will finish ahead of Cook on a per-game basis once he's back healthy, and my rankings reflect that. However, I think it's going to be relatively difficult to predict who the RB1 will be on any given week when both are active, and for that reason, I'm lower on both players than I otherwise would be if they weren't splitting touches. Now entering Tier 6, Alvin Kamara, despite being suspended for the first 3 games this upcoming season, is next on this list. Prior to last season, Kamara had never finished worse than RB9, and the biggest change to his usage had been a noticeable shift towards more rushing attempts and fewer targets out of the backfield. Even with the missed time, I expect Kamara's receiving volume to take a step up with the additions of Jamal Williams and Derek Carr to this team. Williams should be utilized as the between-the-tackles rushing option, while Carr showed he was content to check down to Josh Jacobs about 4 times per game last year. For Kamara, given his superior pass-catching skill set, I expect that number to reasonably be closer to 6 or more per game, which would be a major improvement from what we saw over the past 2 seasons. Rashad White is next on my list. Key injuries to the O-line last season were an important factor in Tampa Bay finishing with the lowest yards per carry in the NFL at 3.4. And unfortunately, not much has changed as former Pro Bowl center Ryan Jensen was recently placed on IR and is expected to miss all of 2023. That's another huge blow to an already depleted O-line. With that being said, Rashad White made his biggest impact in fantasy via his receiving work, so I'm keeping White at RB24 in my rankings and expecting his passing volume to increase in year 2 without Leonard Fournette on the roster. Next up is Javonte Williams, who's coming off of a major knee injury suffered last October. Despite that, Denver didn't do a whole lot in regards to bolstering their running back room to account for this. Signing career backup Samaje Perine, a player who has only eclipsed 100 carries in a season once as a rookie back in 2017. So unless one of the remaining free agent veteran running backs signed with the Broncos following this upload, Denver appears to be preparing for Williams to be the lead running back. Now with that in mind, I'm lowering expectations for Williams due to the nature of his injury last season, and he should be a fringe RB2/flex option. J.K. Dobbins falls to RB26 in my rankings for a few key reasons. First, he's missed more games than he's played through 3 seasons. Second, he does not catch passes. 25 receptions in 23 games is not good. Third, Dobbins has exactly 1 game in his career with more than 15 carries. Fourth, he plays on a team with a rushing quarterback who will vulture touchdowns near the goal line, further limiting Dobbins' ability to score fantasy points. Literally everyone in this tier for me is going between 10 and 40 picks after Dobbins' ADP. I don't think he's a good value in PPR formats whatsoever. With all that in mind, I can't justify ranking Dobbins any lower than this because if he manages to stay healthy this season, he does have fringe RB2 upside based on his 2020 rookie season finish of RB23 with 15 games played. Boy, it sure is fun talking about these constantly injured running backs, huh? Cam Akers is next for me. Akers is caught in this cycle where for the first half of the season, he's just no good at football. Then the last month of the season rolls around and Akers goes off for these big 100-plus rushing yard performances, and you're asking yourself, where's this been all season? Well, to be completely honest with you, it's maddening to try and guess when Akers will contribute in fantasy. Similar to Dobbins, he really doesn't do much of anything in the receiving game, and he's here on his list because he projects to handle the majority of the backfield touches for the Rams. Not much of a raving review, I know. Alright, strap in for this next one, because I know you've been wondering why Jonathan Taylor hasn't shown up sooner on this list. We've received huge news regarding Taylor, and bear with me, this is going to be a complicated situation. He's on the PUP list to start the year, so he's required to miss a minimum of 4 games, and the deadline Indianapolis set to find a trade for him passed on August 29th. What does this all mean for his season-long value? The reality is we just don't know yet. He is financially disincentivized to sit out once he returns off the PUP list, as Indianapolis is not required to pay him for each game he misses during the regular season due to holding out. Each game week check is equivalent to approximately $250,000. Another interesting detail is that by holding out for the rest of 2023, Taylor would not be able to earn his 4th accrued season, and therefore wouldn't become an unrestricted free agent next summer. So according to the collective bargaining agreement, Taylor would need to report to the team with at least 8 games left in the season to ensure that if the Colts were to employ a tactic where they could have a 2-week roster exemption as soon as he returns, Taylor could still attain an accrued season by participating in 6 games this season. Now I know that was a lot to take in as a fantasy manager. To simplify things, the best case scenario is Taylor plays from week 5 on. If that's the case, Taylor has league-winning upside as a running back who finished as RB6 as a rookie and RB1 in 2021. However, the worst case scenario is that he doesn't report to the team until week 10, and then he plays in 6 of the final 8 games to accrue his 4th season and become an unrestricted free agent in 2024. I've seen Taylor go as late as the 5-6 turn in underdog drafts. Now, obviously, it's a different environment as those are best ball drafts, and first place in Best Ball Mania is $3 million, so the risk is heavily outweighed by the potential reward. But for redraft leagues, I'm planning for the worst case scenario until we receive more information, and for that reason, I can't justify ranking Taylor higher than this. Now, moving on to my final tier on this list, it's all about the committee guys. I was a lot higher on David Montgomery this offseason before Detroit took Jahmyr Gibbs in the first round in the NFL draft, but hey, here we are. Montgomery has never finished worse than RB24 through his first 4 seasons on the Bears, but in that time, he's always been the lead back for his team. Now he's expected to be the co-starter with Gibbs, and the best case scenario for him this season is if he could take on the Jamal Williams touchdown vulture role that saw Williams finish as a fringe RB1 last season. 17 rushing touchdowns was what he put up last year. Williams, that is. Realistically, I don't think that will happen for Montgomery, and that's why I have him ranked as a mid-range RB3. Now, next up is James Cook. Cook burnt fantasy managers in his rookie season back when he was going after pick 100 in drafts. With the current year's ADP of 84, it seems like we haven't learned our lesson given Cook's possible range of outcomes. With only Damien Harris and Latavius Murray on the depth chart to compete with Cook, he should be the primary receiving option of the three. Unfortunately, since Josh Allen is a rushing quarterback, he tends to rely on his scrambling abilities more often than checking down to his running backs. Cook is on one of the best offenses in the NFL, so the touchdown upside is there, but it will be difficult for him, given his situation, to put up consistent RB2 numbers in year 2. After him, I've got Antonio Gibson. With Gibson, we know he's splitting touches with Bijan Robinson, but with new offensive coordinator Eric Bieniemy, I expect Gibson to be utilized more creatively and prioritize getting him more touches overall in this offense, especially in the receiving game. Gibson has a solid floor/ceiling combo with season finishes as RB27, RB12, and RB13 over his career. It wouldn't surprise me if he finished higher than what I have him ranked here. Khalil Herbert is next, presumably filling in as the lead back in Chicago following David Montgomery's departure. However, the Bears also signed veteran running back D'Onta Foreman and drafted rookie Roschon Johnson in the 4th round of this year's NFL draft. So there are plenty of mouths to feed in this backfield, not to mention the fact that his quarterback Justin Fields actually led their team in rushing yards last season by over 300 yards. Needless to say, it's going to be an uphill battle for Herbert to break into RB2 status this season. Last year, in his rookie season, Isaiah Pacheco was RB37, and I do expect some growth going into year 2. However, the reason he isn't higher on this list is because Andy Reid's coaching philosophy has shifted as of late, doing away with the alpha running back approach and instead adopting the ever-popular running back by committee approach. So while Pacheco likely will lead the Chiefs in rushing attempts this season, his lack of involvement as a receiver and Kansas City's notorious reputation for trick plays and goal-to-go situations severely limit Pacheco from being a weekly lineup lock in PPR formats. Up next, I've got the lead running back for the Washington Commanders, Bijan Robinson. You know, the guy who got shot multiple times before his rookie season, then fought back to play in 12 games and lead his team in rushing. Yeah, that guy. Even though he only played in 2 games where he handled more than 50% of the snaps, Robinson averaged 17 carries, about 66 rushing yards, and 1 target per game. Obviously, this workload is more desirable in non-PPR formats, but he should push for an RB3 finish this season given that volume. Heading into year 4, A.J. Dillon is my RB35. He has back-to-back season finishes as a fringe RB2, so ranking him this low feels wrong, but you have to remember that this team will undoubtedly be less efficient under Jordan Love than it was under the former regime. Dillon's best opportunity for fantasy relevance this season would be an injury to Aaron Jones, who, as I mentioned before, will be 29 in December, and anything could happen. Zach Charbonnet is my final running back on this list. Charbonnet is set up to function as the backup to Kenneth Walker in Seattle, but with more pass-catching upside than his teammate. Between the two, it may be a guessing game early in the season as to who will function as the goal line back, as Charbonnet is the bigger body of the two. But there is a weekly upside if Charbonnet can impress early as a receiver out of the backfield on this offense. Well, that's going to conclude things here. I hope you enjoyed the video, learned a few things, and remember to subscribe for more fantasy football content like this. Until next time, bye-bye.